For 15 years, Frank Miller occupied the same corner stool at the Springfield VFW Post 412, quietly nursing his beer and listening to stories he never interrupted. The younger veterans, men in their 20s and 30s back from Iraq and Afghanistan, barely noticed the old man in the worn leather jacket who paid his tab in exact change and never said more than good evening to the bartender. To them, he was just another retiree killing time, maybe a Vietnam-era desk jockey or supply clerk trying to feel relevant among real warriors. Until the night when Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison, 3 tours in Fallujah, had a few too many and declared that no generation ever faced real combat like we have. That's when Frank Miller slowly stood up, walked to the center of the bar, and rolled up his sleeve to reveal a faded tattoo that made 30 combat veterans fall completely silent. 82nd Airborne, D-Day +1, Normandy, 1944. The cocky young soldier who thought he'd seen everything was about to learn what real warfare looked like from a man who had jumped into Nazi-occupied France at 20 years old. Welcome to Forgotten Heroes Stories. Before we continue this powerful story of respect, humility, and the moment when modern warriors met the greatest generation, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe all generations of veterans deserve our respect, hit that subscribe button. These stories bridge the gap between past and present service. The VFW Post 412 on Maple Street had been serving Springfield's veterans since 1946, and its interior hadn't changed much in the decades since. Dark wood paneling lined the walls, decorated with unit patches, faded photographs, and memorabilia from conflicts spanning 7 decades. The bar itself was solid oak, scarred by countless beer bottles and worn smooth by the elbows of men and women who had served their country in ways most civilians would never understand. Frank Miller had been a regular fixture there since his retirement in 1997, arriving every Tuesday and Friday evening at exactly 6:30 p.m. He'd take the same corner stool, the one with a slightly wobbly leg that nobody else wanted, order a Miller High Life, and settle in for 2 hours of quiet observation. Frank was 73 years old with silver hair kept neat, despite his age, and he wore the same brown leather jacket that had seen better decades, but was maintained with the care of someone who understood the value of lasting things. The other patrons barely noticed him anymore. Frank had become part of the furniture, as predictable and unremarkable as the neon Budweiser sign that flickered intermittently above the bar. He never played pool, never joined conversations, never bought rounds for the house. He'd sip his beer slowly, occasionally glance at the television mounted in the corner, and listen to the younger veterans share their stories with the quiet intensity of someone who had his own stories but chose to keep them private. Most of the regular crowd consisted of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, men and women in their 20s and 30s who had served multiple deployments in desert wars that had defined their generation. They were bonded by shared experiences that Frank seemed too old to understand. Roadside bombs, house-to-house fighting in urban environments, the weight of body armor and the hyper-vigilance that came from never knowing when an enemy might strike from a seemingly peaceful crowd. These younger veterans were respectful enough when Frank was around, but they clearly saw him as an outsider. When they talked about combat, their body language subtly excluded him. When they discussed the brotherhood forged in fire, their eyes didn't include the old man nursing his beer in the corner. Frank didn't seem to mind the exclusion, or if he did, he never showed it. He said Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison was the unofficial leader of the younger crowd at VFW Post 412. At 32, he had completed 3 combat tours in Iraq, including 2 deployments to Fallujah during some of the heaviest fighting of the war. Jake was everything you'd expect from a professional soldier: physically fit, mentally sharp, confident in his abilities, and proud of his service record. He wore his experience like armor, and other veterans naturally deferred to his knowledge and authority. Jake's regular group included Corporal Maria Santos, who had served as a medic in Afghanistan, Sergeant Tommy Williams, a former military police officer who had run convoy security in Baghdad, and Specialist David Chen, a communications expert who had spent 18 months at a forward operating base in Helmand Province. Together, they represented the modern American military, diverse, professional, and hardened by combat experiences that their parents' generation couldn't fully comprehend. When they gathered at the VFW, usually on Friday evenings after a long week at their civilian jobs, their conversations inevitably turned to their military service. They'd share stories about firefights in urban environments, the constant threat of improvised explosive devices, and the challenge of fighting an enemy who didn't wear uniforms or follow conventional rules of warfare. Their wars had been different from anything in military history. More complex, more ambiguous, fought among civilian populations where distinguishing friend from foe required split-second decisions that could determine life or death. The thing people don't understand, Jake often said, is that we fought a completely different kind of war than any generation before us. Urban combat, asymmetric warfare, rules of engagement that changed daily. Our grandfathers in World War II, they at least knew who the enemy was. They had clear battle lines, defined objectives. We had to figure it out as we went along. The others would nod in agreement, sharing stories that reinforced their belief that modern combat was uniquely challenging. They respected the veterans who had come before them, at least in principle, but they also believed that contemporary warfare was more demanding, more psychologically complex, and more dangerous than anything previous generations had faced. Frank Miller would listen to these conversations from his corner stool, occasionally glancing in their direction but never participating. If the younger veterans noticed his attention, they didn't acknowledge it. To them, he was just an old man trying to feel connected to a brotherhood he hadn't earned through modern combat. Friday, October 13th, 2006, started like any other at VFW Post 412. The after-work crowd began filtering in around 5:30 p.m. Workers from the nearby factory, a few retirees, and the usual group of younger veterans who had claimed their territory around the pool table and the corner booze. Frank arrived at his customary 6:30, nodded to bartender Bill Rodriguez, a Gulf War veteran who had been serving drinks at the VFW for 8 years, and took his usual seat. The atmosphere was more charged than usual that evening. Jake Morrison had just returned from a 2-week reserve duty training exercise at Fort Bragg, and he was full of stories about working with active duty units who were preparing for deployment. Maria Santos had received word that her former unit in Afghanistan had been involved in a significant firefight the week before. Everyone was safe, but the incident had stirred up memories and emotions she thought she'd processed. "You know what gets me?" Jake said, settling into his usual booth with a beer and speaking loud enough for most of the bar to hear, "is when people try to compare our wars to older ones, like somehow what we went through isn't as legitimate, because we had better equipment or whatever." Tommy Williams nodded emphatically. "Right? Like my grandfather was in Vietnam, and he's always talking about how tough they had it, but they never faced anything like what we dealt with in Iraq. IEDs weren't a thing in Vietnam. They never had to worry about suicide bombers walking into their base disguised as civilians." "Exactly," Maria chimed in. "And the psychological warfare aspect. The enemy we fought. They didn't follow any rules. They used women and children as shields. They booby-trapped schools and hospitals. At least in World War II, both sides were professional militaries. There was some semblance of honor, some recognition of the rules of war." David Chen, who had been quietly listening while lining up a pool shot, straightened up and added his perspective. "Plus, we had to do multiple deployments. Our grandfathers went overseas, fought their war, and came home when it was over. We kept going back, tour after tour, watching the same places we'd already fought for get overrun again. That's a different kind of psychological toll." Jake took a long drink of his beer and looked around the bar, making sure his words carried to anyone who might be listening. "I'm not trying to disrespect the older generations," he said, "but let's be honest. No one ever fought real wars like we have. The complexity, the duration, the intensity. What we dealt with in Iraq and Afghanistan was unlike anything in military history." From his corner stool, Frank Miller set down his beer with deliberate precision and turned to look directly at Jake Morrison for the first time in 15 years of shared occupancy of the VFW bar. The slight sound of Frank's beer bottle touching the bar top was quiet, but in the sudden silence that had fallen over the younger veteran's conversation, it seemed loud enough to draw attention. Jake noticed the old man's movement and realized, perhaps for the first time, that Frank had been listening to their entire discussion. "Something wrong, Pops?" Jake asked, his tone carrying just enough edge to suggest that he wasn't particularly interested in Frank's opinion. Frank slowly turned his stool to face the group, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He looked at Jake with eyes that were calm but carried an intensity that made several of the younger veterans pause their conversations and pay attention. "You said no one ever fought real wars like you have," Frank said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the bar despite its low volume. Jake straightened up, sensing a challenge but not understanding its source. "That's right. Modern combat is unlike anything previous generations faced. With all due respect to the older veterans, our wars were more complex, more demanding." Frank nodded slowly, as if considering Jake's words carefully. "More complex than what, exactly?" "Than World War II, Korea, Vietnam," Jake replied, his confidence growing as he sensed support from his friends. "Those were conventional wars, clear battle lines, identifiable enemies, defined objectives. We fought in urban environments against insurgents who blended into civilian populations. We dealt with improvised explosive devices that could be hidden anywhere. Our rules of engagement were—" "I see," Frank interrupted gently. "And you think the men who came before you never faced those challenges?" Jake looked around at his friends, some of whom were beginning to sense that this conversation was taking an unexpected turn. "Look, I'm not trying to disrespect anyone, but yeah, I think what we dealt with was uniquely difficult. The psychological toll, the complexity of the enemy, the duration of the conflict." Frank stood up from his stool. At 73, he wasn't particularly tall or physically imposing, but something about his movement commanded attention. The entire bar had gone quiet now, sensing that something significant was happening. Frank walked slowly toward the center of the room, stopping about 10 feet from Jake's table. "You mentioned psychological warfare," Frank said, his voice still quiet but carrying new authority. "Fighting an enemy that doesn't follow rules. Urban combat. Multiple deployments." Jake nodded, unsure where this was heading but committed to his position. "Right, that's exactly what I'm talking about." Frank reached for the zipper of his brown leather jacket and slowly pulled it down. Underneath, he wore a simple white t-shirt, but what drew everyone's attention was what happened next. Frank began rolling up the sleeve of his left arm, revealing skin that was pale with age but marked with something that made several veterans in the room draw sharp breaths. "You think," Frank said, continuing to roll up his sleeve, "that your generation was the first to face those challenges?" The tattoo that emerged from beneath Frank's sleeve was faded with age but unmistakable in its significance. Black ink that had once been sharp and clear had softened to blue-gray over the decades, but the words were still legible. 82nd Airborne, arched over a paratrooper's wings, with D-Day +1 in Normandy 1944 inscribed below. The silence that followed was profound. Jake Morrison stared at Frank's exposed forearm as if he were seeing a ghost. The 82nd Airborne tattoo wasn't just old military ink. It was a piece of living history that changed everything about the old man they had ignored for 15 years. D-Day +1, Frank said quietly, his sleeve still rolled up, the tattoo visible to everyone in the bar. June 7th, 1944. I was 20 years old when I jumped into Nazi-occupied France with the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment. The younger veterans looked at each other with expressions ranging from shock to embarrassment. Bill Rodriguez, the bartender, had stopped mid-motion while wiping down a glass, his mouth slightly open. "You were a paratrooper?" Maria Santos said, her voice barely above a whisper. Frank nodded. 3 combat jumps, Normandy, Market Garden in Holland, and the Battle of the Bulge. "You mentioned fighting an enemy that doesn't follow rules?" Frank's voice remained calm but carried new weight. "The SS didn't take paratroopers prisoner. If they caught you alive, they shot you on the spot. No Geneva Convention, no rules of engagement." Jake felt his confidence evaporating. We didn't know." "You didn't ask," Frank replied simply. "You mentioned urban combat? We fought house to house through French villages where every building could hide a sniper. You talked about improvised explosives? The Germans booby-trapped everything. Doors, bodies, even injured soldiers left behind as bait." Frank walked closer to their table, and several of the younger veterans instinctively straightened up as if in the presence of a superior officer. "You said you dealt with multiple deployments," Frank continued. "I was overseas for 3 years. 3 years without going home, without a phone call, without email or video chat with my family. When we got wounded, we went to field hospitals and got patched up enough to go back to fighting. When we lost friends, we didn't have counselors or therapy. We dug graves and kept moving." Tommy Williams cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. What's your rank?" "Was Staff Sergeant," Frank replied, "same as Jake here." The comparison hit Jake like a physical blow. Here was a man with the same rank he'd achieved, but who had earned it jumping out of airplanes into enemy territory at 20 years old. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" David Chen asked. "All these years, listening to us talk about our service, and you never mentioned—" "Mentioned what?" Frank interrupted. "That I was a paratrooper? That I fought in World War II? What would that accomplish?" He looked around at their faces. "You young men earned your own service, your own brotherhood. I didn't need to prove anything by talking about something that happened 60 years ago." Frank rolled his sleeve back down slowly, but the impact of what they'd seen couldn't be undone. The atmosphere in the VFW had fundamentally shifted. The younger veterans were no longer the experienced warriors holding court. They were students in the presence of a master they hadn't recognized. "Staff Sergeant Miller," Jake said, using Frank's proper rank for the first time. "I owe you an apology." Frank waved his hand dismissively. "You don't owe me anything. You served your country with honor in your own time, facing your own challenges. That matters." "But we were acting like young men who are proud of their service," Frank interrupted. "There's nothing wrong with that. But there's also nothing wrong with understanding that every generation of warriors faces their own trials." He gestured toward an empty chair at their table. "May I?" The invitation was immediate and unanimous. Frank sat down among them for the first time in 15 years, and suddenly the dynamic had completely changed. These were no longer young veterans tolerating an old man's presence. This was a gathering of warriors across generations. "Tell us about the jump," Maria said quietly. Frank considered her request. "Which one?" "Normandy, D-Day +1. Frank was quiet for a moment, then began to speak in the same measured tone he'd used for years to order his beer. "We took off from England at 2100 hours on June 6th. The plan was to land behind enemy lines and secure key bridges and crossroads before the main invasion force pushed inland. But the weather was terrible. Cloud cover, high winds, anti-aircraft fire that lit up the sky like the 4th of July. He paused, remembering. "My stick, that's the group that jumps together. We were supposed to land in a field near St. Mary-Glise. Instead, we got scattered across 10 miles of French countryside. I landed in a tree, hung up in my chute about 15 feet off the ground, with German voices moving through the woods below me. Jake leaned forward, completely absorbed. "How many men were in your stick?" Tommy asked. 18 jumped. We found 11 alive over the next 3 days. The others? Frank shrugged slightly. Some landed in flooded areas and drowned under the weight of their equipment. Some landed right on top of German positions. War doesn't make exceptions for courage or good intentions. The young veterans listened with an attention they'd never given to Frank before, beginning to understand that the quiet old man had been carrying stories that made their own combat experiences seem like training exercises. Over the next 2 hours, Frank shared stories that none of them had imagined, about spending 72 hours behind enemy lines with no food and limited ammunition, about hand-to-hand combat in French farmhouses where the difference between life and death was measured in seconds, about watching friends die and having to leave their bodies behind because the mission was more important than grief. But he also asked questions about their service, showing genuine interest in their experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan. He wanted to understand the technology they'd used, the tactics they'd employed, the challenges they'd faced in fighting an unconventional enemy. "The IEDs you dealt with," Frank said to Jake, "that's psychological warfare on a level we never experienced. We knew where the enemy lines were. You never knew when the road you'd traveled safely 100 times might kill you on the 101st. Jake felt some of his confidence returning, but now it was tempered with respect rather than arrogance. It was hard to trust anything. Any pile of trash could be a bomb. Any civilian could be an enemy. And you had to make those life-and-death decisions constantly, Frank observed. We had the luxury of knowing that anyone in a German uniform was the enemy. You had to figure it out in real time, with the lives of civilians hanging in the balance." Maria nodded. The rules of engagement were constantly changing. What was allowed one week might be forbidden the next, but we still had to protect ourselves and our teams. "That's a burden we never carried," Frank acknowledged. "When we fought, it was total war. Everything behind enemy lines was a legitimate target. You had to fight a precise war in the middle of chaos." David Chen looked surprised. "You're giving us credit for things we complained about." Frank smiled, the first genuine smile any of them had seen from him. Every generation of warriors faces challenges that are unique to their time and place. Your wars were different from mine, but that doesn't make them easier or harder, just different. He looked around the table at faces that were now focused on him with respect rather than tolerance. "The mistake I hear from all generations is thinking that their war was the only real war, or the hardest war, or the most important war. Truth is, every war is real to the people fighting it. Every generation of veterans has earned their place in this brotherhood." As the evening progressed, the conversation evolved from war stories to a deeper discussion about what it meant to serve across different eras. Frank learned about the volunteer military that had replaced his generation's draft, about multiple deployments that kept families separated for years at a time, about the challenge of returning to a civilian population that had no direct connection to the wars being fought in their name. The younger veterans learned about rationing and victory gardens, about communities where every family had someone in uniform, about wars fought without 24-hour news coverage or instant communication with home. "The hardest part for us," Jake admitted, "is coming home to people who don't understand what we've been through. Most Americans have no connection to the military anymore." Frank nodded. "During our war, everyone was involved. Everyone was making sacrifices. You come home to a country that's been at war for 20 years, but most people live like they're at peace. That's got to be isolating." "It is," Maria confirmed. "Sometimes I feel more comfortable here with other veterans than I do anywhere else." "That's what this place is for," Frank said, gesturing around the VFW bar. "It's where different generations of warriors can understand each other, even when the rest of the world doesn't understand any of us." Tommy looked thoughtful. "Frank, can I ask you something? Why did you come here for 15 years without ever talking to us about your service?" Frank considered the question carefully. "Because I didn't want to be that old guy who wouldn't shut up about his glory days. You earned your own experiences. You didn't need some old paratrooper telling you how things were back in his day." "But you could have helped us understand," David pointed out. "You could have shared your perspective." "Maybe," Frank agreed. "But sometimes the best thing an older veteran can do is just be present, to show that you can survive war and build a life afterward, that there's hope beyond the battlefield." Jake looked around the table, then back at Frank. Would you be willing to keep talking with us? Not just about the war, but about coming home, about what comes after." Frank smiled again. "I've been waiting 15 years for someone to ask." From that Friday night forward, the dynamic at VFW Post 412 changed completely. Frank Miller was no longer the ignored old man in the corner. He was a senior member of an expanded brotherhood that spanned 3 generations of American military service. His corner stool remained his preferred spot, but now it was by choice rather than exclusion. Jake Morrison became Frank's most frequent conversation partner, their friendship built on mutual respect and the recognition that each had faced unique challenges in service to their country. The young staff sergeant learned about leadership in combat from someone who had actually led men in some of the most dangerous operations of World War II, while Frank gained insights into the psychological complexity of modern warfare. Maria Santos discovered that Frank had medical training from his Army service and had served as a combat medic during the Battle of the Bulge. Their conversations about treating wounded soldiers under fire created a bond that transcended the 60-year gap between their respective wars. Tommy Williams and David Chen found in Frank a mentor who understood the weight of responsibility that came with keeping other soldiers alive, whether through military police work in Baghdad or communications operations in Afghanistan. But perhaps the most important change was in how the younger veterans talked about their own service. The arrogance and competitiveness that had characterized their earlier conversations was replaced by a more mature understanding of their place in a long tradition of American military service. "Frank taught us something important," Jake explained to newer members who joined their group. "Every generation thinks they fought the real war, the hard war, the important war. But the truth is, every war is real to the people fighting it. Every generation of veterans has earned their respect." Frank began sharing more stories, but always in response to questions rather than as unsolicited lectures. He talked about the challenges of transitioning from military to civilian life, about dealing with memories that never fully faded, about finding purpose after experiencing the intensity of combat. Frank Miller continued his regular visits to VFW Post 412 until his death in 2011 at age 87. By then, he had become something of a legend among Springfield's veteran community, not because he sought recognition, but because he had bridged the gap between generations of American warriors. His funeral was attended by hundreds of veterans representing conflicts from World War II through the ongoing operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. Jake Morrison, now a successful businessman and leader in the local veteran community, delivered the eulogy. "Frank Miller taught us that respect isn't about age or rank or which war you fought," Jake said. "Respect is about recognizing that every person who wore the uniform made sacrifices that civilians can't understand. He showed us that the veteran community is stronger when we learn from each other instead of competing with each other." The 82nd Airborne tattoo that had started everything was mentioned in Frank's obituary. But those who knew him best understood that his real legacy wasn't about his military decorations or combat record. It was about the bridges he had built between different generations of veterans and the lessons he had taught about humility, respect, and the true meaning of military brotherhood. The corner stool at VFW Post 412 now bears a small brass plaque that reads, Frank Miller, Staff Sergeant, 82nd Airborne, 1944 to 1947. He taught us that every generation of warriors has something to teach and something to learn. But Frank's real monument isn't in brass or stone. It's in the continued conversations between younger and older veterans who learned from his example that military service creates bonds that transcend time, technology, and the specific conflicts that shaped each generation's experience. The strength of America's military isn't just in its weapons or training. It's in the continuity of service that connects every generation of warriors. From the Revolutionary War to the current conflicts in the Middle East, each generation has faced unique challenges while contributing to a tradition of courage and sacrifice that defines our military heritage. Frank Miller's story reminds us that respect isn't about comparing conflicts or competing over who faced the greatest challenges. Every war presents its own difficulties, its own opportunities for heroism, and its own tests of character. The young Marine who stormed the beaches of Iwo Jima faced different challenges than the soldier who cleared houses in Fallujah, but both demonstrated the same fundamental commitment to something greater than themselves. The danger comes when we allow generational pride to become generational arrogance, when we start believing that our war was the only real war, our sacrifices the only meaningful sacrifices. Frank Miller understood that the veteran community grows stronger when different generations learn from each other, rather than dismissing each other's experiences. How many Frank Millers are sitting quietly in VFW halls across America, carrying extraordinary stories, but waiting for someone to ask the right questions? How many bridges could be built if younger veterans took time to listen to older ones, and older veterans took time to understand the unique challenges faced by today's military? Share in the comments. Have you ever misjudged someone's military service based on their age or the era they served? Have you learned something important from a veteran of a different generation? Let this be a place where all generations of American military service can find respect and understanding. Subscribe to Forgotten Hero Stories if you believe that every generation of veterans deserves honor and that the military community is strongest when it stands united across time. Hit that notification bell so you never miss the stories that connect our past and present service members. Tomorrow, we'll share another story of quiet courage and unexpected wisdom. Until then, remember, the uniform may change, the technology may evolve, and the conflicts may differ, but the commitment to serve something greater than oneself remains constant across every generation of American warriors. Thank you for listening. Thank you for serving, and thank you for understanding that respect is something we give to each other, not something we compete to earn.